G'day. Well, didn't we pick it, hey? Weather-wise, can't believe it. After all the rain we've had, to just have such a beautiful morning for Sydney to put on such a wonderful show, and for us to be so incredibly fortunate to be here together again, kind of feels a bit like freedom too, doesn't it? I feel like I spent a year in varying levels of containment to all of a sudden be back here, celebrating our 7th big breakfast together on a perfect day on Sydney Harbour. You'd almost say things are back to normal, but I don't think so. And today we're actually both live and on Zoom. All up, we have nearly 300 people participating. Apart from the people in the room, a lot of people on Zoom also joining us. You've really got to respect Zoom and how it has, in business, helped us so much in the last year. Certainly broadened our ability to communicate and maintain our communications and information sharing. We are incredibly mindful of your valuable time. We like to start on time, we like to finish on time. Our plan at the moment is that we will finish around just before 9 o'clock, but then we will be running a panel, as we always have, for any questions, either from this audience or from our Zoom audience. We'll run the panel for about 15 minutes, so if you're staying for all of it, you'll be out around 9:15. So you can rush home to the office. One last point before we move in. All our presenters today have built their own unique thinking around where they see retail and where they see retail going. So don't be surprised if you see a bit of overlap. This was not, you do this, you do this, you do this, you do... It was quite the opposite. Individually, tell us what you think's going on in retail, why it's going on and what's going to happen. That was the brief. So when you begin to see the overlap, it simply means that maybe they're the points you should be looking at and thinking about, because it's more than one presenter talking to you on it. And all the presentations are fresh, as in just finished. In my case, about 9 o'clock last night. And I don't think yours was too much sooner, was it, Rachel? Okay, so just moving in, we'd firstly like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the traditional custodians of this land we gather on today. I'd also like to, before we go into the presentation, I'd also like to recognise Gary Johnston. Gary was the founder of JCAR. Gary left us 2 weeks ago today, 72 years old. This is a gentleman, a most classically wonderful retail entrepreneur, starting out, having left Dick Smith's, building the real Dick Smith business, taking it from nothing to about 150 shops in Australia and New Zealand, opening a second brand called RTM and building a massive wholesale business. And such a likeable, friendly guy. Always on, always pushing, always game and brave for the next thing. Someone like Gary will certainly be missed. It's also pretty amazing that we sit here today, almost exactly 1 year since we got locked down. And it is incredibly interesting when we just think about what's gone on in the week leading up to 12 months ago. You know, it was about the 16th of March last year that the officials started warning us that up to 150,000 Australians could die from COVID. At that time, they were really worried about our ability in our hospitals to cope with the load. On the 17th of March last year, all Australians overseas were told to come home. They're still trying to come home. Australians on the 18th were advised not to travel overseas. On the 19th, the Reserve Bank government injected about $105 billion into the banking sector because they were worried about the run on the banks. The 20th, our international borders were closed. On the 21st, there was this national outrage of thousands of people dancing on Bondi Beach saying, no, we're not going to obey. On the 22nd, we had $66 billion initial stimulus unleashed into the market to support. This was an early initiative. And then, of course, on the 23rd, 12 months ago, on the 23rd, we all formally went into lockdown. Extraordinary, isn't it? Just a year ago, and what's happened in our lives in that year. There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. And I love the quote. It's from Vladimir Lenin, maybe a little bit misquoted, but pretty much from him. And I think it really speaks to what we all saw going on in March, April and May. And we all talk about the kind of acceleration and things that have kind of impacted and altered our lives. And for those of you who've attended some of our series to date, we are very strong believers in what we've got up here. And that is, on average, it takes 66 days for us to build a new habit, the range being between 18 to 254, depending upon the intensity of that. And we're currently at day 370. We've moved out of level 3 restrictions, and clearly we can assume that we have adopted a lot of new habits. And once we've adopted them and they're set and we start practicing them on a continual basis, they become part of our behaviour, our set behaviour. And when we talk about a changing landscape, it only changes in reality when we adopt those changes and they become ingrained and part of what we do and part of what we think. Today, I'm going to briefly, in my presentation, talk to you about 5 key accelerators. We heard a lot about COVID being an accelerator, if not the ultimate accelerator in retail. It's certainly had an impact on our people. It's had an impact on our ability to interact. It's had a tremendous impact on physical retail in the last 12 months and accordingly affected our behaviour. But we think, collectively, the team at RetailOasis, believe that if we had to isolate the 30 or 40 things that we've seen change or accelerate in the market, we would say that these are the 5 keys. Digital commerce, re-commerce, shopping local, subscription streaming, and work-life rebalance. I'll talk briefly on each one of these if I may. But when we talk about the role of digital commerce, and it's been a bit of a favourite subject for me for a while, I'm just not talking about e-commerce, I'm not talking about click and collect, I'm not talking about click and dispatch, I'm not talking about endless aisle, I'm not talking about social media, I'm actually talking about all of them together and how they play out together and the impact that we've seen. And I love this graph. I know there's plenty of graphs that we've seen and heard and read, but I think this one, and it's out of the US, but this is the US e-commerce penetration of retail sales in what actually happened in those first 8 weeks of lockdown in America. Essentially, their retail sales, as you can see, went from sort of around 15% to now to 26%. Lots of other figures, but that's the clearest number I've seen. Now, clearly that's America, not here, but I think we'd all have to agree that trend, or that trend line, is undoubtedly what we've experienced. And it's not going south. It's continuing to go north, clearly not at quite that extreme rate, but it continues on. My second point, re-commerce. And I need to make an apology briefly to Pip. Pip's going to talk in her presentation at length on this subject, so I'll be really quite brief. And we think this is a really important subject for the future because we now have a lot of consumers a lot more interested and adopting and thinking about reselling clothes. We have a lot more people asking about how do they live a more sustainable life. We have a lot more people asking about how do I reduce my food waste. And we have a lot of people simply wanting to work from home and increase their time there. We also know from Gartner that they predict by 2029 the circular economy will be, to use their words, the only economy, replacing wasteful linear economy, as example by the one on the left and the right. And where I think it gets really interesting is this statistics, and it's from another report out of America, but it talks to resale, as in reuse, resale, is expected to replace fast fashion by 2029. Quite extraordinary. A trend that's going on, being driven by the X, the Y, and notably the Z generations, who seem to have a lot more concern for our planet, our globe, than we do. My third point, shopping locally. And this is a big trend. I mean, who hasn't decided in the last year to increase their level of support of their local shops? I mean, who now makes sure that their cafe or restaurant that they visit is going to be okay? Who makes sure that their local apparel shop is going to be okay by increasing their level of visitation? So we've all kind of really organised ourselves consciously around our local communities and therefore the shops that live within our local communities. And of course, I mean, supporting local businesses was the third highest reason for consumer shopping at a new retailer store or website in the last 3 months. It's a report out of McKinsey. So it just begins to, and the only things you can see above it are price and value. So we'll put price and value aside because we get that as a given. So what's the next most important thing? Being able to shop locally. Yes, it enhances convenience, but I think most of us have also felt it's a reason for me to do something to build or support my community. Streaming subscriptions. Now here's one category that's not just gone off, it's completely reframing a number of subcategories. Just as an indication, I mean, I know we live in uncertain times with restrictions on what we can do socially, and many people have turned to entertainment for relaxation, connection, comfort and stimulation. Just look at Netflix growth in subscribers. It's pretty extraordinary. And out of that subscription obviously comes a different way of thinking about entertainment. I guess most of you are aware that Netflix put a bid in to launch the latest Bond movie. They were knocked back. The bid was $1 billion and they said no. So we're still all sitting here patiently waiting for a movie that's been finished over a year ago. I think we'll find it on Netflix pretty soon. Anyway, let's see. But certainly, and the impact that's had on entertainment generally, the impact that's had on the time we now spend or the more time we now spend in our homes, but then also the impact that our thinking around subscriptions in general and the role of subscriptions, not just for them and not just for our mobile phones, but progressively extending across a lot of other spheres. And indeed, the penetration in the streaming area isn't restricted to just Gen Zs or millennials, it's across the board. My fifth accelerator is this whole thing around work-life balance. And this is a big one, particularly for retail, because it talks to where you will find your consumer in the future. Again, the workplace was severely disrupted by COVID, with the government encouraging employees to work from home where practical. And working from home before and during the height of COVID, you can see the numbers are up there. But the percentage of people that moved to work from home in a society like Australia, where we have a disproportionately high share of white collar, is being massive. And of course, where it gets interesting, in the current studies that are being done show Australians want to continue to work from home even after the pandemic. I found a new way of doing things. I've found it better. I believe I'm as efficient, if not more efficient. I use Zoom, I use this, I use that, and I feel I have a much better work-life balance. And we live on the beachfront in Manly, and I have to tell you, between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. every morning, it's madness. It's so busy. And then at 9 it just goes quiet. So everyone's kind of packing up, putting their surfboard on and rushing home and working from home. Where once upon a time they would have spent that time commuting somewhere. So on average, employees want to work in the office 3 days a week and work from home on at least 2 occasions. So seeing us moving back into a CBD at anything like the level of human density is unlikely. So for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So I've talked about 5 accelerators, and I think you can see, if I say to you digital commerce, you can instantly see, well, okay, if digital commerce is doing well then clearly store traffic's down, but then also traditional media's down. So accelerate, deaccelerate. I didn't want to just talk about those things. What I wanted to talk about is where I think the real decelerators are that will have an impact on retail, if you like, our category, our businesses, in the foreseeable future. So I'm going to talk to 5 decelerators. I think there'll still be an issue around income growth, and income growth has a big impact on disposable income. There will be a massive impact on immigration and population growth. There will be a massive impact on the level of higher education and quality of education. There's going to be a big impact on international travel, but it's not, in my opinion, the Asians coming back or the overseas people coming back into Australia, it's the Australians travelling overseas. Because one of the clearest things is, because all of us have been here for the last year, the money we would have spent offshore, we spent it plus some here. So the actual net effect, I believe, is that we'll see a decline in disposable income in the marketplace if we get to travel again. And then the finally big issue for all retailers is China supply, and it's a decelerator because clearly most businesses are considering or looking at or working to do things differently. So let's quickly talk about them. We'll start with income growth. A report out of Australian Bureau of Statistics. There was virtually no increase in average household disposable income during what's known as what Gardner calls the dog days. So they're the period from about 2012 to now. There's been little or no, in real terms, household income growth. That's been driven by, obviously, a lot of things. It's been driven by lower levels of productivity. It's been driven by lower inflation, and it's been driven by essentially high or full employment. About the worst thing that could happen to us societally as we make our way out of COVID is to go back to where we were. Because where we don't want to be is back in dog days. We would like to think that as we make our way out of COVID, we will have a brighter future. But I do suspect for the next couple of years, given all the circumstance and all the situation, income growth is going to remain flat. Therefore, household expendable income will remain flat, disposable income will remain flat. Of course, that impacts retail. And immigration and population growth. Here's the other big issue for us. The pandemic has brought the 21st century surge in immigration in Australia to a sudden halt. I think we can all look back now on what happened in Australia and how we avoided the GST turn down in 2008 and attribute it to the single greatest point, our immigration rate. At that time, our immigration rate was way over 2.5%, and that immigration rate really covered up a lot of holes for us. We don't have it anymore. We've used immigration cleverly to retain the growth in our economic situation. And in 2020, more people left Australia than arrived. This is the first immigration outflow since the end of the Second World War. Behavioural response to the pandemic will keep immigration well below our normal levels, certainly for the next few years. It'll be unlikely that we will see any real growth in population for at least another 2 or 3 years. And population growth coupled with income growth creates confidence, creates looser wallets and discretionary spend. So they're two issues that are working at the other end. But wait, there's more. Higher education. We've heard a lot about the lack of overseas students coming into Australia, and everyone goes, oh yeah, that's not so good for the people renting out their flats or what they can do for retail. That's only a minor part of the problem. This is again a statistic out of America. Universities are set to suffer another year of financial blow because their export arm has all but been snapped off. As you can see there, this is in America, but you can see pretty clearly that the international student base is quite small in numbers, but their fees make up a substantial share. And we go, oh yeah, that's good, that's America. This is Australia. When you get a university like RMIT, 46% are international students. And you can see the list, they're all really high. So education is Australia's third largest export. International borders closed, universities will continue to struggle due to the reliance on lucrative overseas students. Now, for me, the biggest impact here is the quality of education. Like all of us, you need funds to support something, and in this case, you need funds to support teaching or quality of teaching. When the money's not there, gradually the universities cut and trim, like we all do, and you would argue for us that the foreseeable educational standards in Australia will be in decline. I think that has a big impact on new people coming into retail, new people coming into businesses everywhere. My fourth point, international travel, and I mentioned this already. Australian tourism industry suffered an extraordinary 99.7% decrease, the largest fall ever recorded. But offsetting that, this is a great piece of work which was done by Deloitte by Access Economics, thank you very much, and it indicated the loss and what we had to do to recover from the loss. In essence, the summary says that the people staying at home, if they spent 70% of the money that they would have spent offshore, were okay. They didn't, they spent more, which is why we've had more money in our economy for the last year. And then finally, my last point, China supply. 94% of Fortune 1000 companies have experienced coronavirus supply chain disruption. I know one of our speakers today is going to talk a little bit deeper about this, but it all applies to the time of delivery of that parcel and indeed a lack of manufacturing going on in China. I think we have to be realists here and also overlay the situation, the political situation that's going on between Australia and China. Add to the disruption of the supply chain in the last year. Had product, no product, had product, no product, wrong season. That sort of stuff that went on. I mean, there wouldn't be a vertical retailer in the country who's not considering other sources and desensitising their level of support into the Chinese market. So, in summary, I had 5 things that I think we've got to worry about because they're deaccelerating. Income growth, immigration and population, higher education, international travel, and China supply. All of those, I believe, will have a direct impact on retail in the foreseeable future, the next 2 to 3 years. And then we have top 5 accelerators. Yes, we are rethinking and reorganising our work-life balance, and we will continue to. But I think the acceleration that's gone on in the last year has established a great trend. We are seeing a real push around subscription and streaming, which places a whole lot of pressure on other forms of entertainment, but it also gets us to think a lot more about the role of subscription in other product areas. Shopping locally is a big push in this, and I think now that we've established habits about revisiting our local cafes and our local restaurants and working more from home, we will see a concentration and a move of the ant trail and where people are likely to want to shop or likely to be wanted to be entertained. Number 2 accelerator, the push into re-commerce. And this is a biggie. This is something that we will see progressively as the X, Y and Z generations become more dominant, and they are, and they will change us irrefutably in the next 3 to 5 years. And the whole principle about re-commerce, reuse, it will be increasingly more and more important to them. And finally, of course, and I know this is the most obvious one, but the whole push that we've seen in the last 12 months around the digital commerce. So I'd leave you with this thought: there's no future in towing the line. That quote's from Pippa Kulmar. So up next, I've got Rachel Kelly. So Rachel, as you all know, is Head of Sales at Afterpay, a wonderful partner and friend. And I'll leave it to you. Thank you.
I think the Pippa comment about towing the line is daughter to dad. I think that might be the reference. As Steve said, it's fantastic to be here, and as a Melburnian, and as Anna has quite rightly pointed out, the view wins every time in Sydney. So yes, agree, it's a fantastic view, and great weather. I just wanted to say thank you. It's fantastic to see so many retailers in the room. We've had it come off the back of a huge Afterpay day, and I just want to thank everyone for their continued support and partnership. And the Afterpay sales and marketing team are at the front, so please feel free to hassle them and make sure that they're delivering for you. Yes, Alex, you can make a beeline straight over there. I just wanted to talk today and just share some thoughts around the generational shift that we're seeing and the impact on retail. So Steve has taken sort of quite a macro view, and we want to now go through and have a look at what's actually happening with the generations. What does this change mean, and where will we see this play out in the retail space? Yep, great. So if we think through the long-term implications of the generational shift and what it will mean for retailers, millennials, if we think it through, they saw the aftermath of the GFC, and they were a rising force and continue to be in terms of spend within the economy. And 3 years on from when the GFC happened, no one thought that we would have COVID or be in the situation that we're currently in and be facing another pandemic with the next generation. So we see that Gen Z, they're now facing the same challenges as their previous generation was. So we add the acceleration that Steve referenced about online, and we see a different change in terms of spending and financial ways of payment, and we see that the world is going to look fundamentally different. So just to remind everyone about who the generations are, because I always think millennials are younger than what they possibly are, and I think that's a reference to me being the Gen X one. So Gen Z, they're aged 9 to 24. So if we think through the Gen Z, they started school around recession, and now they're going to exit high school on the back of COVID. So this informs their psyche, the way they think about money, the way they think about payments, and the way they think about retail. And if we look at the population, it's an interesting one. We're at this absolute sort of crossover point between the generations. So the population of millennials and younger generation will outnumber the older generation by FY24. And that's only a few short years away. So when we think about this, and what does that mean to have this crossover of generations? Well, it's actually not too long ago when we all experienced mobile traffic overtaking desktop and the profound acceleration that had on online shopping. And these pivotal moments mean, well, it's a chance for us to pause, reflect and go, so what's going to happen that's going to be a similar disruptor? And we saw the people who won, the retailers that won in terms of the online space. And so how do we think about what's the disruption, how we're going to accelerate different trends, and what will the new opportunities be? And I think the key question is what's required to win and win well in this time. The other is when you add that the population and the generation crossover, look at the spend. So you can see that the dark line is millennials. So by the time you get to 2030, they're up sort of $22 billion. And then you see the rise of Gen Z. So we've got this crossover of generation points and then a significant inflection in terms of spend. So the maturity in their earnings and their spending is yet to come. So when we think through Gen Z and millennial spending, and what will the different forces be that shape it? One is value, and Steve sort of touched on it in terms of the re-economy and the experience, but they're going to be shaped by the changes that have occurred. So value, purpose, meaning are all going to be significantly important for this next generation. The other, which is very close to my heart, is they're digital natives. So they don't know anything else other than being on their phone. They don't know anything other than being permanently attached. And I think what we'll see in that space is if we think about brands and how they view brands, it's like when we think about bricks and mortar and retail. So the way that they curate their brands is exactly the same as we do when we're a retailer and want to get our space. All the landlord community know we want to be next to this brand, we don't want to be next to that one, we want to be there. Well, that's exactly what this generation is doing in terms of the adjacency. So they do it in a digital way, but it's exactly the same thing in terms of how they build their personal brand and how they want to be represented. They're the first, as we said, the fully generation to be immersed in social media. It's all about image, it's all about brand and how they identify with themselves. So these key forces are going to shape that next generation. And I wanted to just touch on three key trends as it relates to shaping retail. The first one, and excuse me for the finance slide, but it talks to, if we think about the compounding impact of online growth within the generations and the pull forward of investment. So Steve spoke about it, and I think a number of the speakers are, and we see it in the paper all the time, about retailers talking to how much investment they've pulled forward into the digital space. So we're going to see that, compounding impact of that growth suggests that by the time we get to 2025, will be between 24 and 37% of all spend will be online. So it's a significant impact, and what it says is that we think through about having a key moment for omni-channel retailers and how omni-channel retailers can succeed against the very strength of pure players, and that is by having an omni-channel approach. So having a channel-led view is the biggest inhibitor for omni-channel retailers to succeed. And we've seen it in terms of viewing each channel as its own distinct way, its own distinct customer. That is the biggest inhibitor for omni-channels to succeed. And then next is just to think about this sense of what's happening in the physical retail space. So when we think through, we're going to have a lot more vacancies and space within the physical retail centres. And so that's going to lead to a rise of pop-ups and sort of more temporary locations. But it also talks about how we think about retail metrics. And so I grew up all about sales per square metre, but now when you think about the impact of digital, the change in the consumer behaviour, it's about how do we think about impact per mile. And it's broader than just the four walls of the physical retail space. So when we think about pop-ups, get that. It's also that the flagship becomes the temple. So what we'll see is a mix in terms of the organisation and structure of physical retailers. So the flagship is going to be the actual temple where we want to build the brand and create the brand, and then we'll see a remix and a repurpose in the remainder. I think the key opportunity here is, apart from thinking about impact per square mile, it's just how do we think about the supporting, and Steve spoke about it, the emergence of up-and-coming brands and that spend. So whilst we see a huge amount of shop local, we also see the emergence of brands that are starting up. So the emergence of from entrepreneurial brands to local small ones. So how do we think about supporting and growing those much smaller startup brands? And so online is offline, offline is online. We talk about this consistently, but I just wanted to share with you, channel is the language of business, and, the consistency is the expectation of the consumer. I mean, all of us retailers always talk about channel and etc., but it's not how the customer views us. And so I think what's key here is, how do we make sure that we take a genuinely omni-channel approach that's digital first, even in the physical environment? We know that 75% of young gens will buy via social and will use that as a way to engage with their brands. And what we see here is just the step back in the the in-store space for our Afterpay sales. So we did see a significant impact when you think about COVID and what happened during that time, but then the growth has now pegged straight back. So the omni-channel players have a distinct advantage, but only if they take an omni-channel approach. And I think this last slide is one for me on, Mark Tepperson, a number of you know, says it consistently, and I absolutely believe it, but the last best experience ever had becomes the minimum experience that customers want everywhere. And if you think about that, your last best, most efficient, even in a store world, if that brand, how they engage with you, becomes your expectation everywhere. So that means that retailers, we have to set the bar higher and higher to meet those changing expectations. And we spoke about this as the third one. I'm not going to touch on too much because I know Pippa's going to cover it, but values, conscious consumption, the whole re-economy is a significant trend, and we see that in the purchase behaviour of this Gen Z and millennial consumer. Values and authenticity are more important than ever for those young consumers. And when we see that youngers are spending more on small business. So one of the key things that we saw from the Afterpay data is what I would call is small is big. So SMB, smaller retailers, bespoke brands that talk to purpose and value is absolutely where this next generation is spending their dollars. It's high double-digit growth. It's been sustained from really, as Steve was talking about, the start of COVID, and then we've seen that accelerate through. So whether that be from a landlord perspective or from a retailer perspective, how we partner with some of these smaller brands as they emerge is going to be a key differentiator in trying to engage the next generation of consumers. And so just in summary, Gen Z and millennials will soon overtake the older generation in market size, and it's not too far away. We're talking about FY24. It's just a few years away, and we're going to see those significant shifts occur. Authentic, local and value-based brands continue to resonate with the consumer, and you see that translate into dollars. Online is here to stay, but integrated offerings are essential. So how do we think about impact per much broader mile than just the 4 square walls of the retail store? And small is big. Small is big and values matter. So this next generation, as Steve was talking about, are going to be the ones that will step change the way that we look at retail. And it'll be exciting to see what happens and which retailers continue to put that investment forward. Thank you.
So now it gets exciting. We've got an international speaker. Marie comes from Coresight out of New York, and we particularly wanted, because we haven't managed to get to New York this year, we particularly wanted somebody who was deeply experienced in the retail space, deeply experienced in soft goods in retail, Marie has an experience previously with S&P as an analyst, and she's been actually part of the Coresight's team now for a number of years. So we asked her to offer an opinion on both what's happening in America and what she sees happening in the future. Thank you, Marie.
Thank you, Steve. It's so nice to be here with all of you in Sydney, and I hope in the future to be able to come to Sydney and join you there. Thank you. If you just go for slide ahead. I'm not managing my slides today, so forgive me. So today I'm here to discuss the new consumer, some behaviors that we think will stick, behaviors that will revert, what retail looks like in 2020, and I have a few longer term opportunities. Next slide. This is just a little bit about Coresight. We sit at the intersection of retail and technology. We were born as a think tank in Li and Fung in 2014 by Deborah Weinswig. She's our founder and CEO, and she had long experience on Wall Street, as did I. Our team consists of analysts, consultants, advisors, and we all are deeply passionate about retail. And we're looking at how tech is disrupting and reshaping the world of retail. Next slide. And we have offices in seven cities or 8 cities, 4 continents, truly global. Our focus is the US, the UK, China, Asia. That's where a lot of our research is driven. Next slide. And let's move ahead. Next slide. So the new consumer, some behaviors that we think will stick. Well, we entered 2020 with COVID, changed the way the consumer lived. We started spending more time, more money on digital channels because there was really nowhere else to go. By the end of last year, 2020, digital accounted for about 14% of retail sales in the US. That was up from a little over 10. In 1 year, we had a big jump up. And it's not just spending money, it's spending time. The consumer is playing online, researching online, discovering online, and our life and working online, right? People are working from home. So we have a new way of living. And while it was very sudden a year ago, really within the last week, as we sit here on March 23rd, the return back in 2021 will be much more gradual. It will not be a sudden on-off switch. Next slide. What's happened with consumers taking the time to stay at home? They had the time to think about their health. And as I heard the previous speaker, they became very value focused. So it's about retailers that have a point of view on social values like sustainability, environmentally conscious, health and wellness. This is what the consumer has been thinking about. And they're expecting it from the retailers that they shop at, as well as the brands that they buy. Next slide. And so at home, new modes of work, new modes of shopping, and new modes of entertaining. We see many consumers at home, and it's been hard to find a work-life balance. Approximately 77% think that working from home is less stressful. At the same time, they're asking for one day when they don't have to attend any meetings. There is a great deal of Zoom fatigue, but the more professional part of our society have been able to work from home, maintain their income, or even with slight drops in income, have seen huge boosts to their savings rate because in truth, you haven't been spending money commuting, eating out, entertaining, or travel. We have been seeing consumers focusing on live streaming. TikTok, which began in China and captured approximately 10% of e-commerce in China in 2018, came to America, and we're starting to Walmart just did 2 TikTok collaborations, and we expect many more to do the same. Live streaming is big. Next slide. So some behaviors that we think will revert because of the dearth of entertainment in 2020. Consumers shifted. They shifted from a long secular track of services over goods back to goods over services. And as you can see on the chart, you have that declining trend jumped radically up when consumers were left at home. At first, what we found were that consumers were focused on their health, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, their health, their family, their finances. Once things settled and we started to get back a little bit in May and June, the consumers started shopping. Some areas of shopping really changed. We went from essential to non-essential. Non-essential being discretionary. During COVID, and really we're just emerging from COVID at this point, but you saw spikes in grocery e-commerce, spikes in CPG, spikes in cleansers and toiletries. And at the same time, you saw reduction in clothing and apparel, footwear, accessories, though we're gradually starting to see that come back. Next chart, or next page. Yeah, we're starting to see a return to discretionary. And in fact, we, in recent surveys, we've seen the consumer really just ready to go outside, buy pretty new clothing, celebrate with their friends, eat out, and attend venues that really we haven't attended for a full year. So while there was the shift in 2020, we're gradually moving away from that. There's a lot of pent-up demand. If you look at what happened in China, and China had a much quicker recovery, we saw what they coined as revenge shopping. And we've seen that in America as well. Consumers that have had the money have spent on luxury goods because they weren't spending on other. There's been people trading up in terms of aspiration because they really, the spending rate, the savings rate had jumped over 10%. It was up 12.5%. It was even higher early on in COVID, yet by the end of the year, it was around 12%. And there's lots of firepower for the consumer to spend money. And we just think that as the economy opens back up, that the consumer will be starting to travel domestically, they'll be, and when possible, traveling internationally. And that will then pull money out of the essential retailers or retailers that focus on essential products and more broadly disperse consumer spending. Next slide. And what happened during COVID was a lot of people left big cities. Cities like New York, San Francisco, Chicago, Washington, D.C. saw an exodus of 1 to 3% of their population. And the uptick occurred in small suburban towns in Texas, where they had double-digit growth. We also had double-digit growth out on Long Island, East Hampton, where a lot of New Yorkers moved out. As consumers start to feel safe in terms of less of a need to social distance, as the vaccine is spread throughout the country, as we have herd immunity, we think that the consumers will return to the city, will have domestic travel, and there will be, maybe at the end of this year or early next year, some pickup in international travel too. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about retail in this year, 2021. So really, I picked a few highlights just from the last month, February 2 to March 5, just to show you how much movement there is in retail in the US. And it's really, COVID accelerated so many things. We saw acceleration of e-commerce. We saw acceleration of trends in terms of the consumer with value, a value focus. The consumer had cared about sustainability and social values for the last few years, but it really went full drive last year. But here, as we start 2021, you can see some of the headlines are that Westfield is leaving the US market. It took a day for Belk to file bankruptcy and then exit bankruptcy. Disney is closing 20% of their stores. A real surprise, HBC, the Hudson Bay Company, one of the oldest department stores in the world, announced their plans to spin off Saks Online from the Saks department stores. Also, you see on the other side, May 3rd at Walmart, they announced a plan to invest $350 billion in a 10-year plan to promote US manufacturing. So just interesting tidbits, but retail is really on the move. And that's just the point I'm trying to make here. Next slide. So these are factors that really are important. I mean, for the birth rate to drop 300,000 this year, year over year, will really impact how retailers stock their shelves, what happens at the children's end of retail, CPG products. Also, at the same time, there's going to be a wealth effect. Retail home prices have gone up 10%. That generally means that consumers feel wealthier. They haven't necessarily cashed in, but they often take out equity home loans and improve their homes. They do extensions, outside gardening, maybe build a swimming pool. And then another macro picture that just changes the retail landscape and forces retailers to think about who their consumer is and where they are, is that these large cities have lost significant population. I live in Manhattan, and a year ago at this time, there was no one on the streets, versus in 2019, it took me an hour to get across town. Last year with COVID, the end of March, there was no one on the streets. I could walk across the street without looking because there weren't cars either. And this year, it's different. It's slowly coming back, but the city looks different. There's a lot of closed stores. There's full blocks where there are no stores. So we need a retail resurgence. Next slide. To this point, we had almost 9,000 stores closed last year, according to our store tracker. We track 400 or more companies in the United States. And so we're not tracking all the small stores, we're not tracking restaurants, but we are tracking retailers. And there were 9,000 last year. This year to date, we have more store openings announced than store closures. And if you look at the complexion, it's dollar stores, it's value stores that are opening. And what we're seeing closed, it's really a rationalization of the department stores. Electronics have really moved online. So Bed Bath and Beyond, they're in the midst of a turnaround. And 7-Eleven convenience has moved online. Next slide. So we're reimagining the store. The store isn't going away, but it's doing a lot of things, and it's got to do a lot of things great. At Coresight, we have a framework, Best at Retail, and it's about brand building, experiences, in-store service, and technology. Well, the store has to excel at all of these things. You've got to empower your associates. They have to have tech so that they know the consumer who's in front of them. There's a trail from the consumer online. You have a history of what the consumer buys, and technology that also enables the sales associate to spend more time engaging with the consumer and doing and automating a lot of the redundant tasks. And the store has become a fulfillment hub. It's there's reverse logistics in it. There's returns coming to this online, buy online, return to store, or buy online, pick up in store. Next slide. And then the mall is being repurposed as well. We have the reverse logistics, we have grocery tenants. Digitally native brands have found the allure of actually meeting their consumer, because we know that the idea of being omni-channel, of being everywhere present for the consumer, wins every time over a single channel. And then we're seeing at the mall healthcare tenants as well as new CBD tenants, and these are driving traffic. Next slide. And then some longer term opportunities. We have 6 of them. I'm just going to touch on them lightly, but we think they're exciting and they'll be around, 2022 and beyond. So here we go. Next slide. So let's move to the next slide. These are the six of them listed, but the convergence of retail and healthcare online and offline. Here you see a few examples. Amazon has done some acquisitions in the space. You're having drive-up healthcare facilities for consumers, and Walmart is in the space. This is a way to diversify. Retail can become retail as a service, right? Just like software as a service. So it's a different way to be part of your consumers' lives. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, okay, thank you. And you're seeing like the informed consumer wants to take care of their own healthcare management. We're seeing a big rise in VC funding for healthcare management, especially for behavioral or mental health care. And this will have implications in the next 2 or 3 years. The money raised, big sums, and this will have implications in 2022 and beyond. Next slide. And then new ways to shop. Last year in May, June, when we saw the breakup of the global supply chain, and we saw how consumers were concerned about social distancing, we got the idea of creating a shopping festival. It took months to make it come together, but we created 1010, a shopping festival. We had more than 20 retailers, and we had many charitable, philanthropic organizations that played a part. Tech companies were involved as well, and we had tech companies that directly made contributions to these philanthropic organizations that were a part of 1010. And really what we were trying to do was pull the holidays forward into 1010 being October 10th. Really 2 months ahead of when it normally begins, or 6 weeks ahead anyway. And we were very successful. We had brands like Guess participate, Tanger, which is an outlet, and it was a lot of fun. And then live streaming. This is a new way to shop, and it's frankly, it's addictive. That's the best way to put it. And then adaptive, inclusive, we really have to include everybody. That's one of the values that today's consumers want. Next slide. Longer term, local manufacturing, supply chain modernization. Because of what happened last year with the supply chain breaking, because of this pandemic, we really are looking at resiliency, agility, and diversity, RAD, to be really the call as we go forward to make the retail ecosystem more resilient. We have our new president going behind Buy America. Walmart is behind Buy America. The technology on the right-hand side of my screen, that is new technology that enables 3D manufacturing on site. So there's lots of ways that we can change retail so that it's really a part of the 21st century, better meet supply demand, and create a very vibrant retail economy. Next slide. And then retail is turbo driven by technology. So we are seeing that you can shop virtually, that we have digital signage. The truck at the end is actually, you can have an automated truck or it could be driven by a person, but this is shopping coming to you, kind of like 21st century milkman. Next slide. And finally, fintech is really being sidelined by changes that we have in the financial markets, where we have new forms of payment and we have and it's disrupting many different venues, just payments, lending, personal finance, financial markets, and consumer banking. So we see all of this impacting retail, the consumer, and the way we shop and the way we live in the next few years. So thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the conference.
Thanks for that amazing intro, Steve. For those that don't know me, that is me. I head up retail industry strategies from Salesforce. Have the great pleasure of working with customers locally here in Australia, also globally and around the region. Today, just to jump back, I'm going to be talking through a lot of the takeaways from NRF. So if I reflect 14 months ago, we were walking up and down streets in chilly New York, walking the stores, seeing what was going on. Obviously this year NRF was a very different experience, very virtual. I've done the hard yards in my pajamas on the couch, consuming all the NRF content for you. And I'm going to summarise that into 10 minutes and 4 key takeaways. So some themes that you can look at. What you'll see from these themes is they are by their nature US-centric, but certainly a lot of the takeaways are going to be relevant for what we're seeing and as the team has already highlighted. So let's jump right in. 4 key themes. One is about this concept of reversed role of store and online. Stores have got different purposes now. Online has obviously grown, as we saw from Steve and Marie, but we'll dive into looking at what that means. We've seen the continued rise of low touch, no touch, contactless. How many different words can you describe for a very similar thing? But some key changes there from a consumer perspective. Shoppers' expectations around service have only increased, so we'll dive into looking at what that means specifically as well, and also the importance and the criticality of social responsibility. So I think as Steve mentioned to kick us off, a lot of these themes are resonating, a bit of repetition, but also you're going to hear some reinforcement of some examples around this. So let's jump in. First one is looking at this reverse role of online and store. So we see over the past sort of 12 months, and this was called out in a number of presentations, that the role has been reversed. It used to be online being a discovery or a traffic driver for what's going on in store, and that continues to happen, and stores are still important, but the role of what they are doing has fundamentally changed. One of the quotes that I really love was that e-commerce was an outpost of store strategy, but now store strategy is a subset of digital strategy for many retailers. So a good frame of reference to think about as we're talking omni-channel overall, how does that come together, and really thinking through what that means. So a few examples that I'll call out, but really looking at how stores and the design of stores have been suited for convenience of customers that have already gone through digital research or digital purchase. So you can see Carrefour there, a grocery example in Paris, where they've got mobile ordering and robotic pickup. So similar to lockers that we have in many locations for our own groceries here, slightly more advanced in terms of a faster time to pick up from a customer perspective, and some automation in terms of unlocking the drawers and some complexity around that. But interesting in terms of thinking about consumers done that discovery, consumer has done that pre-purchase, and then doing a click and collect model in a very rapid way for Carrefour. Another example there is Starbucks. So Starbucks experimented with what they call walkthrough. So not completely new if you've ever done a drive-through for Starbucks in the US, but is a store where, again, shoppers order online on their mobile device and pick up the coffee with limited interaction with people in store. So they have a walking path that means there's no overlap, very limited interaction with people in the storefront, and it's all about that low-touch concept. Increasingly, we're seeing that physical locations are becoming the support system for e-commerce, but also we've seen from a number of the sessions that I heard was that conversion in store has increased as people are doing that pre-shopping before they come into store. So it's very surgical, it's very targeted, I know exactly what I want, whether there's inventory available there, I'm going in to pick it up, and then I'm going on my way. So really rethinking how stores are used and really rethinking what that shopper journey looks like overall. On top of that, if we flip that around, we've seen that digital, which historically was more transactional, and yes, let me add something to my cart and checkout, is now more inspirational and is being used for product discovery and other interaction forms. So Steve mentioned a whole variety of those examples before, live stream commerce, virtual selling, looking at the blend between those tools and what you can do from a personalised shopping perspective, but really leveraging digital tools to drive what was previously experiences in store and put them in a digital medium. So second takeaway was really the rise of the low-touch economy. And I mentioned contactless or low contact or increasingly virtual engagements. There are variations on a theme here, but some examples that I'll call out. The first one you can see on the left there is Corner Shop by Capgemini in London. So this is a concept, it's a proof of concept, a tech concept if you will. But what they've done is they've asked shoppers to onboard via a mobile app. So you answer some questions around your preferences, they set up an environment in the physical location that is for you. So nice lighting, nice background music that is appropriate based on what you've told them. And what you can do is you can virtually try on garments in a physical space. So it's this kind of mind meld of overlap where I'm in a physical space, I can see myself in a mirror, but I can select products physically to try on virtually. So it's a no-touch environment for physical goods. You can see that being applied into broader digital concepts as well, but an interesting one that they're testing out. Another example there is Amazon. So doing a whole range of interesting things as you'd expect, everything from Amazon Go. So now you can go into Amazon Go with the palm of your hand rather than your mobile device, which is kind of creepy and freaky, but kind of exciting. The other aspect that is truly interesting is contactless payments. So at a number of petrol stations in the US, you can use Alexa voice to actually pay for your transaction. So I can go fill up the car with petrol, confirm with Alexa that I'm confirming payment on your device in your car and drive off. So contactless payment, but in a very different way. Unsurprisingly, the product team from Alexa kind of shared some numbers and some forecasts, and they expect that to grow pretty rapidly overall. And if we think about Teppo's quote from Rachel before, the experience that I've just had, where else will we see that into the future? So I think that'll be a really interesting one to look at as we look at other experiences. The bottom left example there is Shopline. So in China, they are more or less an e-commerce platform if you're not familiar with them. But what they've done is they've invested in physical stores for their direct-to-consumer brands so those brands can actually grow. So if they don't have a physical presence, they can use these spaces for things like click and collect. They also have live streaming capabilities. So if you want to live stream but you don't have space or you need to be able to have more product interaction, you can go into their studio, live stream, sell your product, have customers come in and actually pick it up from that store. So a really interesting model where traditionally a digital business is looking at physical spaces and how they can reuse them. And the last example there, plenty of chat around robots replacing menial tasks in store or repetitive tasks in store. So thinking everything from inventory and stock taking through to price updates and other aspects, looking at how we can automate that in the physical space to really drive some efficiencies. Takeaway 3 is around service and really consumer expectations continuing to increase here. So just to call out a few numbers, Walmart reported 4 times as many customers using delivery and pickup options over the last 12 months than they've seen previously. McKinsey reported that 75% of consumers have adopted new shopping behaviours during the pandemic, and 40% of European consumers purchase something online that ordinarily they would go into store to purchase. So some big mega trends in terms of what consumers are doing, as we've seen in all of your businesses, I'm sure. But what does that mean? So there was a lot of discussion in a number of sessions around those big trends being more than just refining the supply chain. So really thinking and talking a broader picture around things like smart connected cities, the need for 5G, the need for permanent connectiveness across all those points of the shopper journey and the supply chain, so that we know where product is, where customers are, how we can deliver things in different ways. So some of that's a bit ethereal, but certainly quite interesting in terms of what we will need to do as retailers to deliver some of those experiences going forward. The other aspect of service was around subscription services offered by retailers. So forecast in the next 2 years that direct-to-consumer brands, or 75% of direct-to-consumer brands, will have a subscription offering in what they give to consumers. So it's an area that many are continuing to test, and you can see an example there for BarkBox, who have an offering where you can have a monthly delivery for your pet of toys. And it makes me look like a neglectful pet owner because my dog's got the same toy for the last 18 months. But an interesting offering for them where they've been able to look at, okay, what products do we have available on our shelves or in our stores, and how can we repurpose that inventory for something else? So subscription for them was a great vehicle to get product out to consumers and to get a recurring revenue stream as well. The last takeaway is around social responsibility no longer being optional. So a few call-outs here. We heard about the importance from Marie just a moment ago in terms of the blend of health and retail together. Particularly in the US, the importance of drugstores and chemists as part of their rollout for things like vaccines. So if you think about Walgreens as a business, they 80% of consumers in the US are within an 8-kilometre radius of a Walgreens. So in terms of distribution and last mile, that's really critical for those touch points. So it's going to be interesting to see how businesses like that are expected to step up as part of the health challenge that we're facing at the moment. More broadly than that, Lowe's have done some really interesting work where they've provided more than $1 billion worth of assistance to store associates, first responders, communities, warehouses and the like. And they've done that because it's the right thing to do. So I think certainly we'll see stronger statements from business leaders around that and continuing to do that. Another example from Lowe's is how they've supported 400 black entrepreneurs to get their products onto the shelves into their stores, and they've provided some business grants as part of that to really support the Black Lives Matter movement. And we think about sustainability, and again, Pip's going to talk about this in a moment, but a few key call-outs from Ikea and H&M from my perspective. H&M doing recycling of product in store, so we've seen that in a variety of guises already, but basically I'm going in to buy something new, here are my older items so that they can be reused or recycled, and reducing waste and water in terms of product. Ikea's looking at that where they were in favour of a green recovery in terms of the session that they were talking about, and they're looking at that in a few different ways. So one is the sustainability and the impact of the products. So how can they incorporate different materials into the production, but also how can products have different uses? So if you haven't seen things like IKEA hacks, you can actually go and there's a community of people that look at existing IKEA products and say, well, what else could I do with this old bedside table in my house and get another life for it? So really interesting in terms of thinking across that overall life cycle from a sustainability perspective, not just the supply chain. So 4 key takeaways, but I also want to call out a few key quotes that I thought were either interesting or inspirational. First one from Lululemon, talking about that behavioural shift towards digital. They're not expecting it to snap back in a rapid way, and I completely concur and see that in all the data points that we see. Love this quote from GDR, that the sooner we accept physical retail will become the supporting act for virtual commerce, the sooner we can press the hard reset button and grow. So really a call to action to drive harder and faster. And then again, the CEO from Lowe's talking about not exposing the areas, the back-end complexity potentially of systems or processes to consumers, really making that as seamless as possible and really defining that experience. On top of that, CEO from Suit Supply talking about, well, retail still is detail. That is an old phrase, but is still very relevant. And I think also calling out that the fact that there is a lot of detail now. There are many points of interaction. There are many points or channels of interaction for customers. So thinking about how you can be across that for every single one of your customers. Great call out from the CEO of Wayfair talking about adaptive and haptic tech in this instance and being able to use that for things like feeling materials and product on your devices. So if we think about the continued emergence of digital interactions, that's going to be a really interesting one to watch. And then lastly, I love this quote from the CEO of Saks talking about luxury as the comfort food of retail. So really looking at both the product, but also the experience. And just to reaffirm that, what we've seen from a variety of research we've done at Salesforce is that now 80% of consumers say that the experience they have is as important as the product or service that they're actually buying. So that experience is all of the touch points. That's literally all of your marketing, what happens in store, what happens when they're talking to the contact center. But if you have that great experience, you've got the opportunity to charge a premium for it. And unfortunately, the switching costs for consumers are very low. So you really need to make sure we're hitting that and meeting those expectations. So some key trends there, but what does all that mean? Well, we're seeing that act out in a few different ways. We're seeing the continued emergence of this concept of shopping at the edge. So more and more consumers are shopping on things like social. We'll continue to shop in areas like voice commerce and the like. So 16% of purchases will be made in these emerging commerce channels. I just mentioned that 80% of consumers expect that experience and expect it to be connected. It's table stakes now, it needs to happen. At the same time, consumers understand the value and the importance of their data. 66% say they want a personalised experience because you should know something about me. And if you don't know something about me, that's a challenge. But if you do know something about me, then do something meaningful with it. So there's this real exchange expectation from a consumer perspective now. And then lastly, 70% unsurprisingly expect consistent service. So that is removing silos from our businesses so that customers just see us as one cohesive unit. So some key points there and key trends we're seeing. Hopefully that's whet your appetite in terms of some takeaways from NRF. If it has whet your appetite, as a little plug, next Thursday we have an amazing event coming up called Salesforce Live for Retail and Consumer Goods. We've got an amazing crew of folks that will be sharing their perspectives. So the wonderful Katie McNamara, who's the Chief Strategy and Customer Officer from Super Retail Group. We have Angus McDonald, who's the CEO from Barbecues Galore. Sam Bain, who is the Chief Digital Officer from Mecca. Sarah O'Toole, who heads up digital at Coca-Cola. And the wonderful Fleur Brown, who will provide some insights from the ARA. So really action-packed agenda coming up there. You can register at salesforce.com/liveanz or chat to me later and I'll make sure you can jump on that. Thanks everyone. I'll hand over to Pip.
Okay, I'm going to wrap up and talk about the re-economy. So everyone's kind of subtly hinted on sustainability, or not so subtly. And so if Steve's presentation was meta, then this presentation is a bit existential. And kind of thinking about what does retail look like when we drill out into the fundamentals of the society that we live within. I don't know about you, I'm a big fan of Cosmos, for anyone that's watched that. Carl Sagan, astrophysicist. And a famous quote from him is, "Survival is the exception, not the rule." And he's talking about humanity and the Earth. So the Earth's been around for 4.5 billion years and modern humans for 200,000. So we think that survival is the rule, but it's actually the exception. And if you look at the current trajectory of society, you can kind of see a lot of this starting to show up, the tension within society. One of the greatest myths that lives within the society we're in is that economic growth, and that there is totally plausibly continual economic growth for as long as we can possibly think forward. And yet, logically that can't possibly be true because we live in a finite world, so economic growth can't continue at a rapid rate. So then you put these two together and we end up in this world of, okay, well, we could continue doing things as we've always done them, and actually there's a huge cost to humanity because our survival is attached to that. Or we have to totally rethink the system, and it's kind of been this jarring paradigm of it's one or the other, and it's really easy to stay where we are. It's going to be really, really difficult to get over there, and is that socialism? Is it like, what is that? And I think there's a middle way in all of this, and it's been emerging on the back of COVID that actually there's something around the reusing of limited resource to create an infinite cycle of resource that can be unsold. So that's kind of the hypothesis of this presentation and a lot of what we see shifting in retail. So very like business 101, but if we think of basic business drivers, they are decrease the cost of doing business, increase the frequency of occasion that a customer is visiting a store, grow the customer base and create retention. The traditional way that's been answered is let's reduce the cost of the product, let's get gross margin up, let's make the business more profitable. Let's increase seasons, introduce more categories, and like fast fashion did that in a big way if we think about a specific category. Let's introduce diffusion lines, collabs, sub-brands to expand our appeal to other groups. And then let's create CRM and loyalty programs. And this is really growth that's entirely fueled by more cheaper resource. It really doesn't answer the issue of sustainability. And the emerging solution that's kind of popped out on the back of COVID has been this idea that to decrease the cost of doing business, actually we could reuse the product that's already in the cycle. We wouldn't have that cost associated with the business. It would be much cheaper to manufacture if we're just recycling and repairing what we're making. We could introduce rental to increase the frequency because no one would own it. They'd have to come back to a store in order to pick up more of that good. And we could resell to new audiences. So those that couldn't necessarily afford luxury goods here, well, we could resell them through a platform elsewhere to create greater appeal. And then we could repair the product to create loyalty. So I'm going to give you some examples about how this is showing up. It's growth fueled by an infinite recycling of resource. And I'm going to call it, well, I'm not calling it, it's being called the re-economy. So this idea, reuse is all about decreasing the cost of doing business, rental increasing the frequency of occasion, resell broadening the customer base, and repair creating customer loyalty. But I want to, before we go into the examples, one more quote, which I think is a great summary of who's leading the charge in this area, from Peter Thiel. So we live in a world where courage is in much shorter supply than genius. We all have great ideas in this room, but when we actually comes down to it and putting that idea into motion, it's an entirely different process. And these are examples of businesses, and some really big businesses like H&M and Ikea that are being incredibly courageous in approaching a way of finding growth for their business. So let's start with reuse. Patagonia is obviously going to be a really obvious one in here, but I want to talk about Ikea and also Loop, which is coming to Australia. So James briefly mentioned this, the buyback program. This is now in 27 countries. It's actually pretty cool for anyone that has IKEA furniture they want to resell. Pop online, enter what you have, and they'll actually spit you out an estimate of what the resale value on that will be. And that resale value is then spent on more IKEA goods. So it's creating this cycle to almost keep the revenue within the business. So getting someone to come back at the same time. This is also a business that wants to be 100% circular by 2030. So like the largest furniture manufacturer wants to become entirely circular. It says a lot about the direction of that particular industry and retail as a whole. We then have Patagonia, so obviously very famous for their worn wear and not buying that jacket, but rather getting it repaired. But now what you can do is say your jacket is totally destroyed, you can send it to them and they'll refashion it and sell it online for about the same price. And it's kind of this unique, bespoke bit of Patagonia that's, I mean, it's definitely a look, but you can find that. And then we've got Loop. Now this is actually rolling out into Woolworths this year, and Loop is taking that idea of like the milk bottle. The milk bottle used to be owned by the dairy farmers, and you would return the milk bottle back to the dairy farmers. The consumer never owned the packaging. And this is the same concept here. The consumer doesn't own the packaging, Loop does. So you put in a deposit, say it's like $2, $3. I go to Ulta or I go to Walgreens, Kroger, Loblaws or Carrefour. I pick up my face wash. I think there's a Dermalogica face cleanser you can buy. It comes in beautiful aluminium packaging delivered to me, so I don't have to go to the store. Once I'm done, I just let Loop know. They pick up the box of goods, return it, and then I get it refilled. So like the packaging remains in the hands of the supermarket or the FMCG provider. It's not the consumer's. It's not owned by the consumer, and it's really beautiful packaging. They can like invest a lot more into the design aesthetic. And then we have rental. Now, rental is not anything new, but there's some really interesting things going on. I want to talk about the Inner West Tool Library, which is a local business in Sydney, but I think it's actually quite cool. Ralph Lauren and Selfridges. So this has popped up in the Inner West, but it's also in Brisbane and the Gold Coast, and it's a tool library. And I think this is really interesting in light of the big retailers in this area, and it's a community rental for a library of things. You pay a monthly subscription, because apparently a drill is used for about 15 minutes when someone buys one. It's lifetime use, so why do you need to buy one? And you can basically rock up. This is at, there's Brisbane Tool Library. This one's run out of Petersham Bolo, and you can, on a Saturday, reserve the item you want. I think you pay $75 a year, and it's everything from like car seats through to anything the community has that they're not fully using. And these are rolling out as little retail stores for people to come and interact. And the one in Brisbane is actually incredible. You can also redeem as a part of your subscription on workshops to learn how to use that particular tool. And then this is just launched. I'm not fully sold on this idea, but I think it's really interesting that brands by themselves are getting into rental. So Ralph Lauren has just launched the Lauren Look, which is basically rent the runway for Ralph Lauren. You can go online, you can select a wardrobe. It's $125 a month, so it's a little bit more expensive than Rent the Runway. Obviously, they're appealing to a more luxury consumer, but with entirely Ralph Lauren goods. So I think it'll be interesting to watch this to see if then it's something that's viable for other brands to look at. And Selfridges. So Selfridges have done a huge amount when it comes to sustainability with Project Earth. And Alana Weston, who's the chairwoman of Selfridges, this is her big platform for the business, is totally rethinking retail. Retail is unsustainable in its current form, and so they're doing a lot, and one of them is Re-Selfridges, which is quite cool. It's through partnership with her, and they're reselling what's in their archive as well, so what the business has held on to that are actually like incredibly exclusive archive items that people can rent out, as well as what's latest in fashion, so like a Bottega Veneta bag, and then having it in store. And this is right at the front of the store, kind of in prime position where they've got the rental being showcased. And then we move into resell. Sellpy, Vestia Collective and ThredUp. ThredUp's IPOing tomorrow, so this will be really fascinating and kind of very timely to watch. Repeating Steve, but just to reiterate, resell will be bigger than fast fashion. I think everyone's been thinking, well, what's going to replace fast fashion? Because it's kind of, there's been a lot of justification of space that it takes up. They have been really slow into online, and then we have those like extreme fast fashion players that can recycle or bring in a new design within 24 hours of a Kardashian wearing something. And so everyone's been looking at it like it's super unsustainable. So what is the future? And so interestingly, and I don't know if many people have caught up on this, but H&M actually owns 70% of a business called Sellpy, which is a reselling business. It started in Sweden, it's expanded to Austria and Germany on the back of their investment. And then they're looking at ways of strategically partnering with it. So there have been a couple of pop-ups in And Other Stories, one of H&M's brands. And then we have Vestia Collective, who just became a unicorn thanks to Kering Group, who own Gucci and a bunch of other luxury goods. And Vestia Collective is the same thing. It's a reselling platform for luxury goods. They raised $4.6 million, and they're now valued at over $1 billion. And then we have ThredUp, which I just mentioned. They're IPOing tomorrow. Their valuation is also at $1.1 billion. So we've got another unicorn sitting in the retail area. And they're really famous for their clean-out kits. So whenever you want to cull your wardrobe, you basically go online, they'll send you a kit, you just put everything in it and send it back to them, and they'll work out to resell it on your behalf. So really operating on that idea of like, we're fundamentally lazy, and the easier you make it for us, the more likely we will to do it. And then finishing up with repair. So we've got the House of Materialization. This is actually a retail concept in an old building in Alexanderplatz in Berlin. So really rethinking space. Girlfriend, which I look at like the next Lululemon, and Farfetch. So this is the House of Materialization. This is really interesting, and it's in the old House of Statistics in Alexanderplatz in Berlin. It's a pretty ugly building, and they've basically partnered with NFPs, local retailers, and research institutes to create this thing called the House of Materialization. And you can do anything within here to do with DIY. So it's everything from how to repurpose a couch, rethinking waste within the Berlin district. And you can see there's even like a bike repair shop, because there's obviously the mode of transport around Berlin, but rethinking the use of space, and it's almost like a mini mall just for DIY. And then Girlfriend. I love this brand. It's gender fluid, totally inclusive, and kind of picking up where Lululemon has been really slow to enter. They talk a lot about the fact that only 1% of clothing is actually recycled, and so all of this clothing is designed to be recycled. So once you've finished with your leggings, which are made from recycled materials, you send them back to them and they re-girlfriend them. They take the fabric and they'll either use it for insulation, or they actually repurpose it into garments to be created again. So repurpose it into leggings or a top. And then finish with Farfetch. So Farfetch is now valued at $21 billion US. They're, they introduced Farfetch Fix, which is this idea that expanding their services just from selling goods on Farfetch, but rather, say you've got that Chanel bag, like we all do, and you want it to be customized for you. And so you can send it to them, and this one she's had spray painted and made into like a personalised object that's all of a sudden now worth a lot more than it would have been originally. Or you've got an old Celine bag and you don't know what to do with it, you want to keep it, but it's kind of gross. You'd send it to them, they'll send you a quote and they'll clean it up. And so then that provides them with this line where they can then offer the customer the opportunity to resell, because now the bag's up to scratch to be resold on their website. Or it's a means to keep the customer engaged with them. So the bag they bought from Farfetch, they can then have repaired through Farfetch, and kind of continuing that line with the customer. And so this is kind of, I feel like, a large part of where it's at moving forward. Not for every category, but for a lot of goods-based categories, where it's a cheap from growth fueled by more cheaper resources into growth fueled by this infinite cycle of resources. So thinking about how sustainability and the traditional capital models of retail can actually work together in a way where they benefit one another. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, that's it for presentations today. But we did say we'd just get the presenters up. I'll get the Pip, Rachel, Maria, you online? James? If there's any questions that you'd like us to address or answer, we're really happy to do that. Anything you think you'd like to ask? Normally we get inundated. This is really quiet. Alex has something to say. Alex.
There's a surprise. Come on, Alex.
Okay, I'm totally put on the spot. I don't have anything to say. No, thank you for this. This was very insightful. Let me think of a question. I'm from Berlin, Alexanderplatz, actually. This is the square that was named after me. You put me on the spot, Sandy. I guess one question is, what I thought was interesting in seeing all of this is a lot of those themes you and we spoke about last year already. And so it seems like COVID was really not the change maker, but the accelerator of sorts, more than anything. Would you agree? Or?
Absolutely. I think what we've seen, what we've experienced, and I wouldn't mind one or two of the others add to this, is that, we knew a whole lot of things were happening, and I think most of us have been saying to ourselves, I'll have to worry about that in 3 to 5 years. And that 3 to 5 year horizon became tomorrow, around April. And those things that we thought we would have to address, technology upgrades, platform upgrades, store reductions, reorganising our brand, all of those things, all of a sudden just went crunch. So it is, as I said at the beginning, Alex, the great accelerator.
Yeah, and I think so. I think it just brought it all forward. So everything that we saw, instead of it being sort of in a couple of years, it's now. No, just so that when you're thinking about from a digital perspective, this notion of how to leverage your store portfolio in a more effective way, well, people were kind of thinking about that, and then all of a sudden it's like, hang on, we're now shut and we've got to work out what to do with our stock. So it just forced everyone to move really quickly and overnight do things that they never would. So I remember Erica on the podcast was saying, you know, the notion that people would have to pack up and go home and still run their business with less than 24 hours notice just would never have occurred, but it's actually what everyone did. And so it's sort of that point of Pippa's around courage. Well, sort of COVID forced us to have a bit of courage and take a risk that otherwise we may not have done.
Well, we would have put it off.
Put it off, but you would have found something else to do with the investment. Then all of a sudden you didn't have the opportunity to think differently.
So it's, from that perspective, super exciting.
Absolutely it is. Absolutely it is. Thank you, Alex. Any? Yeah, great. Here we go.
So we've got a question that just came in from Zara Model online, which says, given our population in Oz is siloed from the rest of the world, to what extent do you think the US teams will flow into Oz consumer behavior?
I'll have a go at it. I think the reality is, first and foremost, that as Australians, we've been incredibly fortunate with COVID. We've spent a lot of time in the last year. We started a podcast and we started interviewing pretty well every week, every fortnight, retailers. We started doing it domestically and then we started talking to international retailers. And it was when we started talking to international retailers, we went, oh my God, they're really experiencing COVID, we aren't. We have been incredibly cautious, we have been incredibly compliant. I think it falls into our culture with our convicts heritage. And then you look at the rest of the world and the level of damage that's gone on with COVID. We've just skated through this thing. Yes, we've had to adjust. Yes, we've had lockdowns, but we've had incredibly low incidence. And we will, once we're vaccinated, and vaccination's pretty important because I think with vaccination, fear will reduce. And I feel that out of that, there'll be a level of normality. But we haven't experienced anything like what the rest of the world's experienced. But there are still very good lessons for us to learn from what's gone on overseas. Like I used the reference of education, and I used a specific one out of America that showed you the level of tuition fees being paid by overseas students. And then I showed you the loss in Australia, and the loss in Australia in that area was greater. So I think we've got to look at not just one category, but look at multiple categories. But in essence, what's certainly going on in America, and I think the adoption of digital commerce is the classic. And again, I showed you a graph at the front, which was supplied by the US Economics Department. And I don't have a graph for Australia because the numbers would be lower, but the rates of growth would be similar and the spike would be similar, but just off a lower base. So there are clear guidelines, there are clear learnings, but then you've got to interpret it into a population of 25 million. And I'm going to use the word lucky Australians who've avoided mostly the real impact of COVID physically.
Could I add something?
Yes.
So I wanted to say courage is what it took to be a retailer last year in America. And while we were surprised, and I think retailers in general were surprised at the strength of retail sales by the end of the year, what it took as they went through the year, it took courage. And what many retailers did to navigate was, like, brands they reduced their exposure to tertiary retailers. They limited their lines. It was hard to get their assortments in anyway because of the broken supply chain, but they reduced their SKU count. They watched, they watched their brick and mortar sales drop dramatically while online grew phenomenally. Their sales at the end of the year may have been flat, up marginally, down marginally, but their EBITDA margins, their profitability were up more than anybody would have thought. So, I mean, that was a big takeaway. And then the essential retailers obviously just really were cranking.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? Oh, yeah, great. SD.
We talked about some pretty heavy stuff today, but you always seem to have one controversial view, and I feel like you kind of let us off lightly because you talked about your 10 things. So what is it? It must be on the tip of your tongue.
Well, it's actually there. It's there. What concerns me is we're seeing a bit of a bounce at the moment, and things are pretty good. And I do think, as a nation, we're going to come out of the next couple of weeks once government funding reduces in reasonable shape. What does concern me is the ongoing flatness of household income and the lack of immigration. So household income and inflation and population growth and immigration growth has served Australia better economically than just about any other country since the Second World War. And neither of them will be in play. And certainly will not be in play in 21, 22 or 23. And that's a big concern to me. That's a concern that says we will have flat economic growth in real terms. We're going to have no real growth in disposable income, household income, and we'll have less people. And Australian retail has never dealt with that. Never dealt with that. And that's the big concern. So it's covered in those three D accelerators, really. And how we address them, I think, is going to be a real challenge. Because we have to actually think small, which dealt with Pip's subject, because we've spent our lives, everything we've done has been predicated on economic growth. And even before we bring in the subject of re-commerce, we're going to have to think about sizing to fit.
Thank you.
One more?
Thank you. The change that you've had... Sorry, is it on? The change that we talked about in terms of that work-life balance and the moving away from, I guess, going more local, what sort of shift do you see in terms of retail in the CBD? I mean, that's been our highest paying retailers across, all the cities across the globe. And I guess just seeing in Sydney how much traffic has moved away from our CBDs, how much of that is going to be ongoing, and what's going to replace some of that retail in the city, and I guess what's going to bring the retailers back to the city if the traffic's never going to be at the same levels it was at before?
I mean, it's a super interesting one. We obviously have the opportunity to look at a whole lot of data from an Afterpay perspective. I think the interesting thing is that the large-scale flagship stores are always going to be. So Pitt Street, Chadstone, etc., they're going to command those key rents, and I think that's just going to be the way it is, because they will get their foot traffic back, and customers do want to go and connect. And we certainly see that at the moment the intent purchase is far higher. So the average order value in store is anywhere between 40 and 50% up on the previous year. So people are researching, they're going in with a purpose, and they're making a purchase. I think that the high streets and the strips, which is this sort of SMB play, is where there'll be the growth, and the bit that gets lost is what happens in this middle that doesn't have the big anchor tenants. And I think one of the things that's an interesting one going on is that grocery online growth is always largely been the anchors and department stores or shopping centres. So when that starts to move, what happens for the retail format? So I think, that's a challenge and trying to navigate that through. But the top end, if you want to go into Pitt Street or Bondi, you'll always be paying top dollar. I don't think there's anything out of that. But the high streets, and certainly we can see that through the data, that is where the consumers are going.
All good? We're finished. Thank you very much.